Hi everyone, and welcome today to my presentation, Man in the Middle Unleashed. My name is Mark Moberts and I work for Society in the Netherlands, and I've been working in test automation for about 4.5 years now. I am here today to talk to you about how I use Man in the Middle to take control of my own network traffic. Basically, what I'm doing is hacking my own network, and I'm using Robot Framework for that. I must say that this is probably mostly suitable for testing purposes, but if you think of any way to use this within RPA, I would love to hear why that is also an option. So one of the challenges that I, my colleagues, and probably you as well have encountered is that sometimes we have to test functionality that is not easily testable. It might seem untestable. And if we find a way, it might not be very suitable for automation. We may have to manipulate some code or other ways of being able to test it. So in those cases, we might even decide not to test it at all. And that is a risk that we can sometimes deem acceptable. But maybe if we look a little further, we might find some new technique that allows us to test it after all. And today I am going to tell you one of those stories. So our story starts today with one of my colleagues. My colleague worked for one of the largest companies in the Netherlands, and he worked on one application within one team. And the application his team made use of the generic login functionality that the company had available. And that application he worked on was deemed very, very important. And because it was so incredibly important, the company decided that if the generic login server would fail, their application would have to make use of some backup. So, their team made a backup functionality that made contact to another server. And if ever the first login failed, they would make sure that they tried to get the data from the backup login server. And the thing is that my colleague had to test this somehow. He had to find a way to simulate that the login server that was always up was actually down, but he did not have any mocks or stubs available at that time. What was funny was that at the same time, I was working on a similar problem. At least I think it's pretty similar. So I work in an assignment where we have to deal with a lot of data. And some data, as you can now see in white, for example, comes from our own database, while in red and blue, that data comes from various other sources. Those are our external dependencies. And at the moment, it works like this. We have a request to our backend. That backend sends some requests out or gets some data from another database. That information is relayed back to the backend, and that information is sent to our frontend. And that makes it so that I can see it when I look up the data. There's a lot to say about how this currently works, but yeah, for me, that's the reality I have to deal with. There's various ways to improve this, but there's no time, no money, and yeah, it's not going to change very soon. The only way I can test this is by actually breaking the environment, because what happens and what we saw is that if one of those services is down, our backend does not get a response, and we actually saw that we got infinite loading. So we had to find a way to deal with this. So what we did is we made a generic API handler, and that generic API handler makes it so that we can just see technical error for the data that's unavailable, and the rest is shown. Because as you saw before, all of the data was hidden behind a loading screen. And the thing is that to test this, I had to find a way to simulate that those requests came back with a technical error inside, because I cannot take down the server from another team easily. And the only way I could actually test this normally was by just changing the code, by adjusting the URLs that were targeted. And if I changed those URLs, I was able to simulate that a server did not exist. But this is not ideal for automation. So I too had to find a different way to deal with this. And I think this quote really sums it up nicely. If everyone were as I should be, the world would be a perfect place. But we do not live in an ideal world. We do not have ideal working circumstances. And well, we don't have anything to complain in our field. But There's always things to improve, but it's not always something that is going to happen. So sometimes as test automation engineers, we just have to deal with those challenges. We just have to test the untestable. To deal with this challenge, we actually have to take a look at the various solutions that we have. The first of which is mocking and stubbing. And I already quickly mentioned it. Mocking and stubbing are well-established techniques. They are often used to fake data, but they have some challenges. And for mocking and stubbing, you often need developers. They have specific knowledge that most testers don't have. They have access that most testers don't have, that you do need to actually make sure that the code, instead of going to the actual application, makes use of the stub or a mock. And another thing that mocks and stubs have is that they are often environment-wide. At least in the situations that I have dealt with them, meant that I could not run certain tests in parallel, because that would mean that all of my other tests would fail, because I had to turn a stub off or a mock off to make sure those tests could be tested. So they do have some challenges. Another solution is to start testing manually. So instead of trying to run this with automation, just use your hands. And I already mentioned that in my solution, I could break my environment, I could change something in the code, but this is not a viable solution for long term. I'm not going to do this every time we have a new release. I'm not going to do this every time there's a new PR. And we're running in CI/CD pipelines. We do need to automate these kind of things, and especially if they're so important, because we use them hundreds of thousands of times during our application. So don't test it at all. While it is technically a solution, is in this case also not an option. And there's probably a lot more solutions. You can think of, for example, setting up organization-wide contract-based testing, which is a very nice way, which basically comes down to mocking and stubbing. But instead of having to maintain those yourself, the team that built the application will make sure that you have that, as far as my knowledge goes. But this is not something you set up overnight. This takes a long time, and a lot of people have to be on board before something like this can actually happen. This led to my colleague coming up with the solution to use man in the middle. And man in the middle is a technique that is well known in cybersecurity circles, but we can use it as well. So man in the middle basically is exactly what it says. We have a front end, we have a back end, they communicate with each other, and there is someone in between. And in this case, it's Rob Gibb from the BJs, well known for their hit Man in the Middle. And the thing is with this man in the middle is he basically intercepts all communication, but he can just relay that on without doing anything with it. So everything the front end sends to the back end will come there, and everything the back end sends back to the front end will also arrive nicely. But the problem with this man in the middle, and that's why it's well known in cybersecurity, is because he can also decide to manipulate or to block those requests. So that nice free Wi-Fi network in the coffee shop might actually be operated by someone who uses man in the middle to steal your data. And that is a threat to cybersecurity, but it's also something that we can use as testers. And for that, we use the man in the middle proxy package. It's a Python package, it's freely available. And because of that security risk, I urge you to only use this for applications that you or your team or your company are responsible for. Don't use this for anything else. I have an example to show you how this works using Python. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a Python file. That Python file includes some man in the middle import. We have our robot framework URL. We make a request, which is a basic man in the middle function. We are going to get our pretty URL, which is the current URL of the website we are trying to visit, the request we are sending. If it equals our robot framework URL, not contains, but equals, we will kill that flow, which basically means that we are going to block every communication to that website. So what we're going to do is we're going to use man-in-the-middle dump. It's one of the packages that man-in-the-middle proxy has. We're going to use that for running this script. What we're going to do is we're going to start a browser. We're going to reroute that browser through our proxy, and then we can do as we want, except for visiting Robot Framework, because we have just said we have blocked that website. Now, before me is the same file as we have just seen in the PowerPoint. So I can start running this file, man-in-the-middle dump, using man-in-the-middle dump, with my settings file, man-in-the-middle test.py. And you will see that a proxy server is starting up at our host 8080. Now, I have started up an incognito Chrome browser already. And as you can see, I have Switchy Omega as a plugin added to my Chrome. And Switchy Omega allows me to use proxies. And in this case, I'm going to use my proxy that is set up already, man-in-the-middle. Now, I can go to google.com, which works perfectly. But when I try to go to the Robot Framework website, you will see that there is an error. When I go to the RoboCon website, no problem at all. And if I turn my proxy off, and I then move on to the Robot Framework website, I can reach it as normal. So you can see that, as I have said in my Python file, every time I will try to reach the Robot Framework website, at least the homepage of the Robot Framework website, I will kill the flow and thus block every request to that website. Well, we've just seen how to do this in Python, but we're at a Robot Framework conference, so I'm also going to show you how you can implement this in Robot Framework directly. So the easiest way that you can do this, and that my colleague and I came up with at first, is to use man-in-the-middle dump directly. We can use the process library, which is included in Robot Framework itself, to start a process. And we run our Python file as usual. The only thing with this is that if you have a lot of changes you want to do, you either get a very large Python file, or you are going to use a lot of different Python files for all of your changes. So one of those solutions for me and my colleague was to actually use cookies. We would add a cookie if you wanted to do something special, so we didn't have to restart the proxy server every time we had a different thing we wanted to do. That way we could still specify, at least partly, what manipulation we wanted to perform. And combined with this start the server, you will also need to start the browser using a proxy. But this totally depends on whatever library you are using, whether that's browser or Selenium or some other browser. And this is a possible solution, but it's not ideal. You need Python knowledge, you need to start a process which might be running or might keep running in the background, and we don't want that to happen. So that's why I decided to try and make this into a Robot Framework library. And I had some challenges at first, and that's where my second colleague came in, because independently he had created the Flask UI combined with man-in-the-middle, completely independent from the two of us. But it can do similar things. You can block or delay or change a request depending on whatever setting you choose, which is a very nice way. He also helped me in implementing it in Robot Framework, because thanks to him, I knew for sure what part of my code was wrong, what was working, etc. And eventually that led to the man-in-the-middle library. And let's start this off by saying, I don't think it's very used much. I think I'm the only one at the moment, but maybe some colleagues. But if you want to take a look at it, please do. I would love to get some feedback on it, and I would love to hear whatever you need for your testing purposes. So the thing about this library is that by using it, you can block or delay or manipulate directly from Robot Framework itself. You don't need those special files. You don't need to do any Python coding. You don't need those sub-processes. That is all handled within a Robot Framework itself. And the neat part about this is that it also runs isolated. So compared to mocking or stubbing, which is, at least in my experience, often environment-wide, you can also do this within one single process. So if I want to do some test where I manipulate that request, I can just start my test with a browser, with a proxy instead of a regular browser. I can do my test, and at the end, I'm done. And no other test was influenced by the fact that the proxy has run. And I think that's one of the key strengths of using man in the middle. Well, how to do this? In your robot framework file, you will have to import the library, of course. You will have to make a test case that blocks a website in this case. We have a generic start browser with proxy keyword. You will have to make this yourself, specify to the browser library that you are using. Then you can make use of the keywords from the man in the middle library. And what isn't specified here is that you will also need to start the proxy itself. You can add something to the block list. So now every URL that contains robot framework in it will be blocked. And if we now use the run keyword and return status, we can see that hopefully going to the robot framework website will fail. Before we take a look at how we can run this using robot framework, it's a good idea to take a look at the documentation. If you look at the documentation for the man in the middle library, you will find a section about certificates. These can be very helpful when trying to test websites with man in the middle. On the left, you can find all of the keywords that are in the library, and most interesting are, of course, the various ways to manipulate your data. That's the custom response, the status code, the response delay, and the add to block list. And of course, don't forget that you always need to start your proxy, and well, let's say it's a good practice to also stop the proxy. So when going to Visual Studio, to our robot file, we can see a few things. First of all, of course, we have to implement the libraries in our settings. Then we also have a test setup and a test teardown where we start the proxy and stop the proxy. And also here you can see that I use the certificates as well. Then in our variable section, I have a small dictionary that is used to define where my test can eventually find the proxy. And that information is entered when I start a new browser. Then in the test case, you can see we're going to block a website. We're going to open a browser using the proxy. We'll navigate to Google. We'll add robot framework to the block list and try to go to the robot framework website. For my information, I will log the URLs as well. And then we should see that we are unable to reach the robot framework website. Afterwards, we will remove the URL from the block list and reload the page, after which the website should be loaded again. So let's take a look. You can see that man in the middle, the test is starting up. We open Google quickly, and now robot framework is unreachable. And after 5 seconds, we will reload the page and we can see the robot framework website successfully. So now we have set up a test using the man in the middle library. We have seen how we can use man in the middle combined with Python, combined with robot framework and the process library, and also using the man in the middle library itself. So now let me tell you how I actually use this in practice, because these examples are nice, but they don't really show much. I've already told you about the first one. It's to simulate that servers are down. So the idea is I have a request that comes back from my backend containing some data, and I simulate that I have a technical error. That way I can check how my API handler is shown in the front end. But I have a second way of using it. And that is I have some tests that use a lot of data, and they only give me back a false or a true response. And setting all that data takes a lot of time. I already have an API test that does this for me. And I only want to see that if I have false, I have a certain front end response. And if I have a true, I also have a front end response. So I have split these test cases up so that my basically my API tests and my front end tests are split. So in conclusion, I think man in the middle is a possible alternative to existing test marking, giving more control to you as a tester, which can hopefully, as I have shown, be easily integrated with Robot Framework. So I want to say thank you to the organization for having me. A special thanks to my Society colleagues Tim and Sachin who have helped me. And if you have any feedback regarding the library, please let me know. Thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark, for an eye-opening session. All right, we're about to go live. Let's do this. Hey, Mark, welcome to RoboCon.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Good to see you. Really excited about this session. Love security, and I love how you presented this. So let's get to some questions. Now, you mentioned you did a warning, so everyone was warned ahead of time. But what did your security department think about using this testing technique? Did they freak out? Did they block it?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting story because when I implemented it at first, there was no problem. Nothing happened. And the moment that one of my colleagues installed the library, he got a call from security like, "Hey, you're using this. What are you doing?" So I already installed it and I never had a problem. But yeah, it is a buzzword within the security world, and there might be companies that are scared of hearing it.
Yep.
And when you explain it, it's not a problem at all. They can find the package. It's an open source package. You can just see it on every platform available. And yeah,
Excellent.
eventually there was no problem.
Oh, good. For testers new to MITM tactics, what skills would you recommend they learn? What resources were most helpful to you?
Yeah, so this is mostly to manipulate network traffic. So you're updating API requests or you're updating responses that you're getting from your backend. So yeah, most skills are related to requests to HTTP traffic. So the request library from Robot Framework is of course a useful one. And I always combine it with a browser test. Because if I want to do something with a specific request, I can just do that using an API. But I want to see my front end react on those responses that I manipulate or a block to a different website or something. So that's, yeah, of course, you need some browser testing in that case as well. And yeah, what more? I don't know if there's really much more. Python skills, of course, if you want to participate in working on the library.
Awesome. So you did mention support from the community. Is any specific kind of support you're looking for? We had a session on how to contribute to open source. So how could someone help you out?
Yeah, I think Yuri already mentioned it this afternoon. One of the best things to do is, for example, add bug reports. If you find something, I was working on this with a colleague a few days back, and he was using one of the functions that I personally don't use in my project. And we found out that there was a bug in it, and I fixed it. So there's a new version since yesterday. But yeah, knowing that it's being used, getting requests on certain functionality. But if there's a bug, I would love to hear it because I would love to fix it.
Awesome. How does MITM can be tested for Bluetooth connectivity from devices from mobile app and any wireless connectivity using Robot Framework?
Yeah, at this moment, I don't think this package is, it can be used in that combination because it checks for HTTP traffic. So that's the specific Python package that it uses. It's the man in the middle proxy package. So I don't think there's actual Bluetooth connectivity. Man in the middle itself, the technique, the hacking technique can do that, but this package can't. So it's mostly meant to check your HTTP traffic, listen to it, or manipulate it. What you could do is if you're talking about a mobile app, there's HTTP traffic between your app and a backend somewhere, and that could be manipulated if you run the app through the proxy as well.
Nice. I have more than 2,000 robot files and test cases are running on Selenium Grid. Starting MITM proxy doesn't seem friendly to operating systems. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so I'm also using it with quite a large test set. I think I have around 900, which I'm saying test set. This is 2,000 robot files. That's even more. But I think the good thing is that you don't always need to run it. So you only need to run it when you have tests that have to use it as well. So all of the times, if you want to use it in 2,000 robot files, then it might be very demanding on your system. But if you have a few tests for which you could use it, then you could start it up, use it, turn it down, and then at that moment, there might be a little more demand on your system, but all of the other test cases will just run normally.
Can the man-in-the-middle library be used also for blocking the communication between two application APIs?
Technically, yes, not in the way that I currently use it myself. But in that case, you would need to run the communication from one backend or one API through the proxy instead of the way that I use it. I do it with my front end. But yeah, every connection through the proxy will run, and you can manipulate that traffic. So if you change your application to use the proxy instead, then you can still do that.
Cool. But do you know that you can do similar things with browser library, but then you are limited within the browser and can't access traffic from elsewhere?
Yeah. I figured this out a few weeks back. I saw that it was also possible. I think it's a nice functionality as well. But yeah, this library also enables you to do it without using browser library, of course. If you use Selenium or if you're doing any other web libraries.
Awesome. I can't believe how time flies. Let's do a quick lightning round. 2 more questions. Let's clear the board. What kind of features would you like to see in a future release?
Yeah, currently it's mostly to manipulate the traffic, but man in the middle can also listen. And I think that would also be nice if you can check for certain requests to come by. That's one of them.
Awesome. And your library is still labeled pre-release. What needs to be finished before making it an official release?
Yeah, there's still some. There was a bug, so I'm happy that was fixed. But still, there's some code that there's not real nice error handling at the moment. I think that would be a very nice thing to finish before actually making it into a release. I think that's one of the requisites for me. So,
great session, Mark. Before we go, though, any parting words of wisdom you want to leave RoboCon?
I would say that if you ever are doubting, like, hey, I have this idea, should I make it into a library and should I publish it? Just do it. For me, that was a very large step to take, but I'm very happy I did. And I now have quite some colleagues who are also using the functionality. So that makes me very happy.
Very cool. Very good for your cred. So awesome job. So thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate it. And thank you for contributing to RoboCon. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Bye.